Romans chapter 5. Chapter 5 there, verses 6. Verses 6 to 11. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die. Yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if when we were enemies we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And not only that, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received the reconciliation.
Amen. It's lovely to be with you again. Put my notes nearer to my face so I can see them. I had a flashback a couple of days ago. When my dad was always preaching, the first thing he'd ever do was to move the big Bible from the platform and place it somewhere else. He would never read from it. And we were down in Cardiff in Tabernacle Baptist in the days where you had to give a trial sermon to go on the circuit. And Dad picked up the Bible, and he said, I don't know if you've been to Tabernacle in Cardiff, it's got this huge platform, and attached to this Bible was an enormous bookmark. And he pulled it, and pulled it, and pulled it, there was yards and yards of it. And, but they let him go on the circuit after that, thankfully. In the centre of London is a statue to commemorate the work of Lord Shaftesbury in his work for helping the children of London and Britain, those who were exposed to poverty and extortion, and he helped them. Then there's a statue at Piccadilly Circus to commemorate that. Can anybody tell me what the name of that statue? Anybody except Phil Barkley. It's a bit of a trick question. It's not what you think it is.
No, it's not either.
What is the name of that statue at Piccadilly Circus? Come on. I know Phil Barkley.
No, I don't.
Oh, right. Well, most people would describe it as Eros. I don't know if that sort of rings a bell. And if you were to ask most Londoners, they'd probably tell you that it's Eros. But it's in fact, the statue is that of Anteros. Because Eros is selfish in love. It's from the word Eros that we get the word erotic. It would be inappropriate to use Eros. But Anteros is a love that gives. You know, even at the time when, during the Victorian era, when it was placed there, the Christians felt it was inappropriate to have Greek mythology to commemorate the work of Lord Shaftesbury. But tonight I'm going to talk about a love that gives, God's love. And I'm going to talk about a prophet from the Old Testament, a minor prophet. And just to clear up what a minor prophet was, it wasn't that he was insignificant, it was just that the major prophets said more. Like the likes of Isaiah and Jeremiah go on for 60 chapters, but Hosea is limited to just a few chapters. But it doesn't mean to say that what he had to say was insignificant. His words, his prophecies were as important as all the others. At the beginning of the book of Hosea, it tells you a list of kings. If you want to find it, it's sort of after Daniel. You go the major Isaiah, Jeremiah, keep going, and you come to the book of Hosea. It's a bit difficult because it's only a little book, and I'll be sort of making reference to the first couple of chapters. And in the first chapter of Hosea, it gives a list of kings into which this prophecy fits. And it's quite simply this: Israel's in trouble. It's divided against itself. It's divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. In the south is Jerusalem, the capital, with its temple, with its priests, with its worship, with its king on the throne. And up in the north is another kingdom that had been set up on their own. It was never God's plan. In the north they had their own temple. They had their own idea of worship. They had their own priest. and they had their own king. But it was never God's plan. And into this, the poor prophet Hosea, the difficult situation he found himself in, had to prophesy to this northern kingdom. They'd gone astray, they'd messed up big time, but they were still God's people, and God loved them. Now, at the beginning of the book, it says that when Hosea the prophet begins to hear from God, we don't really know how that happened, how he knew that it was God speaking. There were lots of other voices, lots of other ideas about how the Jewish religion should be done in its practical sense. But how he knew that God was speaking to him, we do not know. But he knew that it was God's voice, and he knew to relay that message to these northern tribes and tell them what they had to do. Now, being a prophet during those days and during the Old Testament as a whole wasn't something that you'd readily volunteer for. Because under the Old Testament law in the book of Deuteronomy, if you prophesied that something would happen and it didn't, under the law, they could stone you to death. The very fact that the prophets, the majority of what they had to say, was something that the people didn't want to hear, meant the likelihood of a prophet living to a ripe old age was pretty rare. Because the most of the time that the prophets were speaking was a word of repent and turn. Otherwise, there are consequences for your actions. Now, when Hosea first hears from God, God tells him to do something specific. Again, he has to know that this is God. Otherwise, if he gets it wrong, there are consequences for his actions. Even if he listens to God, there are consequences for his own life. And as we go through the story, we'll find that there's pain involved for him and his family. Humiliation. Because the prophet Hosea is told to get married. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But he's told to marry a specific woman. And her name is Gomer. And her father is Diblaim, just so he knew exactly which Gomer to marry, that he wouldn't marry the wrong person. But there was something wrong about Gomer. Gomer was flawed to the core. There was a flaw in her character, which would lead to infidelity. It would lead to prostitution. She would become a harlot, to use an old word. God knew her heart. But Hosea listened to the voice of God and married this woman. And through the course of time, she bore a child. And God speaks again and tells the prophet to name the child Jezreel. Now, Jezreel was a battlefield. And God was angry at the action of these northern tribes. They'd taken matters into their own hands and gone to war. And God was speaking through the children of Hosea. Now, Jezreel means God sows, God scatters. God was speaking through his children in his own life, that there was something that was going to happen in the future. There was a war at stake. There was trouble around the corner. And it would happen in his own family and in his own marriage. Sometimes you have to use your imagination what happens without going away from the text itself. You can imagine he marries this girl. He knows that there's a flaw in her character. He knew it eventually would lead down the road of prostitution, the lowest of the low of Jewish society. And she bears a child again. You can imagine as he comes home from his duties, and she's not there. There's an excuse that she makes why she's not there, but it doesn't seem to measure up. You know what it's like when you think that people are talking about you. You go into a crowd of people and suddenly there's silence and you know that they're talking about you. You can imagine Hosea walking through the village square and they become quiet. A friend says something about Gomer, that she's been seen with someone. There's rumours. It's the way she acts, the way she dresses, the way she is. And a child is born. And she's pregnant again. And then when the child is born, this little girl, and God says to name the child Lo Ruhema, not loved. If ever there was an indictment upon a child, it would be named a name like that, not loved. You can't imagine that. I've got a new granddaughter called Megan. And if she turns out like Auntie Meg, I'm sure she'd be a good little girl. And the trouble is she lives 200 miles away in Manchester with Stephanie and her husband. You know, in Israeli society, a name was an identity. Very often it's told a story. And Daniel means God is my judge. They tried to change his name to Belteshazzar, which is Bel is my keeper. But he was always Daniel, wasn't he? He always knew that God was on his side, that he was the judge. And a child is born to Gomer, and her name is Lo Ruhema. Now the question must be asked, was it the prophets? He didn't know. There were rumours, there were people talking in the village square, people giving him advice about what she was like and who she's been seen with, and the way she dresses and the way she talks. And if life couldn't get any worse for the poor prophet, it was painful enough as it was to prophesy to his wayward northern tribes, away from Jerusalem, away from where worship should have been centered, away from the king that was placed on the throne. And there came that fateful day. The rumours, the talk, the actions, the way she was, the people that she'd been seen with, and it came the day that she left. Try to use your imagination between the text. And the prophet's left on his own, a single parent, with 2 children. She's gone. The rumours had now become true, and then she was seen with somebody else, and somebody else. And they don't know who she was with in the end. And so in the middle of all of this, she becomes pregnant once again. She's still married to the prophet. And God says, when the child is born, name this child Lo-Ami, not my people. If there was any doubt in the prophet's mind when Lo Ruhema, not loved, was born, there was no doubt that Lo-Ami could never be his. She'd long gone. You can imagine the pain. If you read the text, when you get a chance to read the first couple of chapters of Hosea, when you've got more time, you can feel the pain that this prophet is going through. But the story doesn't end there. When matters couldn't get any worse, God speaks once again and tells Hosea the prophet to go down to the marketplace. By now, she had the price of a common slave upon her head. She'd gone from one lover to another, and then eventually nobody wanted her. Abandoned, penniless, homeless, she was left with no choice but to sell herself for money. A common prostitute. It's not a pretty story. But Hosea the prophet is told to go down to the marketplace and buy her back and love her. Wow. At any point in this, you can imagine the prophet, if he walked away, you'd almost understand. When God first started speaking to him, you could almost understand how he'd walk away. When he's told to marry a woman with a massive flaw in her character, if he walked away, nobody would have judged him. Because God told him to go and buy her back, pay the price of a common slave, and love her. But then he said, the story opens up. Love her as I love Israel. You see, all along the story is about Israel. The story of his life, the pain that he has to go through, the anguish, the disappointment, the questions that he has to ask. God, where are you in all of this? Why me? Why couldn't you send somebody else? Those are the sort of questions I ask, but you don't see it in the text. You see, God loved Israel. They'd gone astray. They'd gone off the tracks. They decided to do their own thing and set up their own kingdom up in the north. And God still loved them, despite everything that they'd done. You see, they'd taken matters into their own hands at Jezreel. It was a battlefield. Lives were lost. They decided to take matters into their own hands, outside of what God's will and purpose was for them. And as Jezreel means God sows, God scatters, like a seed that falls into the ground, in order for it to produce a harvest, it has to die first. You see, just like the poor prophet, his marriage had to die before he could ever flourish. She had to give up everything that she'd taken up in this life, all her lovers, all those people that she felt were important to her, and to come back to the prophet. You see, as far as God was concerned, they were lo ruhema. They'd offended God. To the point where God said, that's it, enough is enough. So eventually they'd gone down a path where God said, that's it. Oh, Annie, you're not my people anymore. We read through to Hosea chapter 2. The last couple of verses. The restoration. In the same way that Gomer is restored back to Hosea. The nation of Israel restored back to God. Verse 21 of Hosea 2. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one, Lorena. I will say to the ones called not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. You see, we serve a risen Saviour. We serve a restoring Saviour. You know, as Peter said in his testimony, never give up. My brother Tim prayed a prayer, and if I've mentioned this before, please forgive me. A number of years ago, he put John 3:16 in his own words. He said, for God so loved the world that he did something about it. You know, that's the God we serve. You know, if we think back, you know, as Pete was recalling sort of being brought up in a home where he needed God and his family needed God. You know, this world needs God. You know, in order for there to be growth within our lives and in the lives of people around us, there needs to be that Jezreel experience, the scattering, the sowing, the seed that needs to fall into the ground and die. You see, the old man must die. Unfortunately, I dig him up now and again, and he makes a right fool of himself. You see, there was a point in our lives where we were like Lo Ruhema. We didn't know the love of God. No. We were far away from him. You know, sometimes you can be in church, you can be sat in the congregation, but you still need to make that own personal relationship with him and that own decision for yourself. You see, there was a time in our lives where we were not his people, Lo Ami. We were far away from him. But that time in our lives, we heard that testimony tonight, of that change in our lives, when the seed began to germinate and grow and produce a harvest in our lives. And in the harvest in the lives of people around as we begin to sow again. Romans chapter 9:25 says this, talking about Hosea. We'll call them my people who are not my people, and we'll call her my loved one who is not my loved one. It's interesting what Pete said. You know, I listen very carefully to the hymns and the prayers and things that people say leading up to when I speak, about never giving up on those who are close to us and our family. I actually changed my message because I felt it was along similar lines to the last one. But I think God got other plans. In Hosea chapter 2, verse 6, is a prayer that I've prayed for many years. especially for one particular person. Hosea 2:6. I will surround her with a wall of thorns and block her path. Talking about Gomer, talking about Israel, talking about us. That God will sometimes hedge us in so that we cannot go forward, so that we have to make a decision. Yes, we've got free will, but God allows circumstances to seemingly run out of control. I know in my life, nearly 20 years ago, He got my attention because it seemed I'd lost everything. There's another prayer that I prayed, and that's Hosea 2:14. And just reading it, it brings up so much emotions, not just God's love for us, but God's love for those who do not know Him. And this is what God did to us in Hosea 2:14. I will lure her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. Wow. No, that's exactly what God did to us, whatever our circumstances are. Sometimes He allows the desert experiences to come upon us, and sometimes we never understand why we have to go through us. Sometimes I remember saying to myself, well, that's it, God, you got my undivided attention now. It's only you. I can either blame you or I can turn to you. And I chose to turn to Him. Many years ago, many of you would know, I lived in Australia, and Helen lived when she was a teenager in Adelaide for a number of years. And she had made the crazy decision that we drive from Perth to Adelaide, which is nearly 2,000 miles. And if you know Australia, that there are deserts between cities. So in the middle of that is the Nullarbor Plain, which means there's no trees. It's not a sandy desert, it's sort of shrub, but there's nothing there. And you get to certain points in the desert where it tells you this is the last water, this is the last petrol for several hundred miles. And in the middle of that point is a halfway point where you can't go back, and it's just as far to go forward. You're probably 100 miles or more from the next service station and the next place where you can get water. And you're at the mercy of a car that you hope's going to make it to the next one, because you're in the middle of nowhere. There's no breakdown service. In those days there was no mobile, so you couldn't phone anyone. There's that sense of vulnerability, but that sense of trust that the car's been maintained, that it's going to reach its destination. And I believe there are times in our Christian experience where we go through those desert experiences. We can't go back. Like Pete said, we can't live on the old experiences. We always need to progress forward. And trust God that we're going to make it to the next one. Because there are points where we think, well, I'm not going to make it. That's it. You know, that's me finished. I can't do this anymore. And I've said that on so many occasions. But it's only on reflection do we realize God's grace through it all. Sometimes looking back over those experiences and realize that God was there all along. That hymn, I remember singing that in my grandmother's funeral and crying my eyes out. Yes, I've missed her, but it was their life. Are you weak and heavy laden? Take it to the Lord in prayer. And I knew that was their experience. I remember, it may sound a bit silly now, the next door neighbour gave me a bar of chocolate and Grampy said to me, you didn't give thanks. It sounds silly, doesn't it? But in everything that they did, they gave thanks. Because he was saved as an older man. He was way into his 40s when he was converted. But he knew what it was to be thankful. And as we reflect back on our lives, I'm sure, given time and given the courage, we could all stand here and tell our story. You know, I could have listened all night to stories like Peter's and others, how God came into our lives and saved us. You know, He saved some of us out of sitting in the church pews. And God spoke to me all those years ago. I spoke about that last time when I was 11. I rededicated my life when my father died when I was 18 years old. It probably wasn't until I was 30 that I fell in love with Jesus and gave a whole new experience and started doing some of the stuff that I do today. You see, God is not a respecter of persons. He's not put off by what we seem as hard in our own eyes. I spoke last time when I was here that for 10 years I've been working with a charity that works with young offenders. I remember the very first time I went to a church service in a prison. And the charity I was worked for was the Church of England. And you very often have this preconceived idea of what Church of England is. And they're not all the same. It's not all like songs of praise. And the chaplain knew that I'd done a bit of preaching. And he said, would you like to pray? And I said, well, what do you want me to read? He said, what do you mean read? He said, just pray. He said, not all of us read prayers. And it was a bit strange. I didn't know. I was in through a crowd of people. There was probably about 60 prisoners there, aged between 15 and 18. Some of them would have been slightly older. Should I close my eyes? After all, they are convicted criminals. And what he said was, at the end of the service, we will call the boys out to prayer. Now, at the time then in Ashford Prison in Bristol, where I was based, a lot of the boys had committed their lives to Jesus. Some of them were baptised. And they said at the end of the service, these boys will come for prayer. And if you feel confident, then you can pray with them. And I thought, well, that's what I'm here for. I'm here to help them, prepare them ready for their release. And I'm here for the year after their release to help them in the community. But I'm also there to help them spiritually. After all, it is a Christian charity. And I sat by this boy. He was obviously born somewhere in the Middle East, just from his appearance. And I sat down beside him, and he said, I was born in Iran. I came over here with my older brother. And he said, I foolishly got in trouble with the police, and that's why I'm here in this prison. He said, I'm a devout Muslim. I used to pray 5 times a day. I was brought up in a very strict Muslim background. I know sections of the Quran off by heart. He said, for some unknown reason I don't even know to this day, I decided to go to church. Now you can't, it's a prison. There are locked doors between your cell, and that you've got to apply in advance. Very often they would have double services because there wasn't enough room in the chapel. Such was the extent of the response to those boys. Because they get to a low point in their life, and they want to they need help. And very often they turn to spiritual help. And as the chaplain said, the prison sometimes can be very spiritual places, because it's a soul-searching time, especially for youngsters. So he said, I sat down in a Christian service for the very first time in my life. And he said, I felt the presence of God. And he was converted. And I spoke to the chaplain after, and I said, what happens next? He said, unfortunately, he said, by the time he comes out, he'll be over 18, he'll be sent back to Iran. He said, because he's converted, he will go into a very uncertain future. You see, God is not a respecter of persons. He's not put off by someone who's an atheist or a Muslim. You see, God saved us. He saw us just where we were. Yes, there needed to be a death in our lives. Then, in order for there to be a harvest in our lives, for us to scatter seed into others. Yes, there was a time where we didn't know God's love. And we weren't his people. But through God's love, we are loved. And we are his people. Thank you.